On the 23rd of October, 1856, a column of about 400 people was hauling handcarts up a long, rocky grade in central Wyoming. The place is called Rocky Ridge. It sits high in the South Pass country, and there is nothing on it but sage and wind. These were emigrants, English, Scottish, and Scandinavian, most of them. They had crossed an ocean and then most of a continent on foot, pulling everything they owned in two wheeled carts they dragged themselves. This was the company traveling under James Willey, and they had started west far too late in the year. The snow caught them, and everybody remembers the storm. But the storm is not what killed the 13 people who died at the bottom of that ridge. What killed them was the ground they lay down on. It took that column somewhere near 27 hours to make about 15 miles over the ridge. They came down into a hollow on Rock Creek in the dark, strung out over miles, some walking, some carried in on the rescue wagons that had found them 2 days before. 13 of them died that night. They were buried the next morning in a single grave. The accounts say there was not strength left in that camp for 13 holes in frozen ground. Now here is the part that ought to stop you cold. Those people were not caught out in the open. They had shelter. The handcart companies were issued large tents, roughly one for every 20 people, and they carried them the whole way. There are accounts from that same autumn of ground frozen so hard the tent pins would not drive, and the people simply stretching the canvas out and crawling under it. They got out of the wind. 13 of them were dead by morning anyway. The storm gets the credit. It gets it in the histories, and it gets it on the stone marker at Rock Creek Hollow. But the wind was not what pulled the heat out of those 13 people. What killed them was the thing they were lying on. My grandfather ran trap lines on the Clark Fork before the roads came into this valley. He learned cold from men who had buried friends over it. And the first thing they taught him about a winter camp was that the roof is the least of it. What matters is what you put between yourself and the ground. I am Orson Rusk. Let's walk through this properly. There are 7 pieces to this. Most men get the first 2 roughly right, at least in theory. The third and the fourth are where the old camping books start to drift, and where a lot of modern advice is repeating a thing it has heard rather than a thing it has measured. The fifth will change what you think about caves. But the seventh got quietly dropped out of the teaching somewhere in the last 100 years, and it is the difference between a bed that works and a bed that looks exactly like a bed that works. If you take one thing away from the next half hour, I would rather it was that one. We will get to all 7. Stay with me. And before I go on, if this is the kind of thing you want more of, put a subscribe on it. Not for my sake. Because the old methods we are digging back up around here, you will want the next one. First, though, I want to state the myth plainly. Because it is still going around, and most of the people carrying it would tell you they are being sensible. It comes in about 4 shapes. The first and the biggest is this: any shelter beats no shelter. Get yourself out of the wind, and you will be all right until morning. Under a ledge, under a wagon, under a tarpaulin, into a hollow. The second is the dry ground rule. Damp is the enemy, and dry is safe. Find a dry patch of dirt, or dry leaves, or a dry stone floor, and you have solved the problem. The third is the pile-it-on rule, that the answer to cold is quantity, and the quantity goes over the top of you. More blankets, more coats, more canvas. Whatever you have, put it on. And the fourth is the oldest and the prettiest, that a cave is the finest shelter in the world, because nature already built it, and it has stood there through 1,000 winters. Every one of those is either wrong or dangerously incomplete. Wrong in a way that has put people in the ground. And this myth is different from most of the others I dig up. It does not kill people who did not know any better. It kills people who are trying. All 13 at Rock Creek did what they had been told, and the careful thing they did was aimed at the wrong enemy entirely. Number 1. What the ground actually is. There are 4 ways a body sheds heat, and they are not equal, and they do not stay in the same order. You radiate it the way a stove does, and in ordinary conditions that is the biggest share of it by a long way. You lose it to moving air, which is what wind does. You lose it to evaporation, off your skin and out of your lungs every time you breathe. And you lose it by conduction, by touching something colder than you are. In ordinary standing about life, conduction is almost nothing. The figures in the medical literature put it at something like 2 or 3% of the total. It barely registers because the only thing you are touching is the soles of your boots. Then you lie down. The moment you go horizontal on cold ground, that rounding error becomes the main event. You are no longer touching the earth with 2 boot soles. You are touching it with your shoulder blades, your hips, your ribs, your thighs, the backs of your arms, and the back of your skull. Instead of 2 small patches, a broad band down the whole back of you is pressed against a solid object that is colder than you are and that will never get full. Still air is close to the best insulator that occurs in nature. That is the whole secret of wool, of down, of fur, of a bird fluffing itself up on a fence wire. None of those materials are warm. They hold still air in place and stop it moving. Dry soil moves heat somewhere about 6 to 20 times faster than still air, depending on what the soil is made of and how packed it is. Wet soil moves it a great deal faster than that. Water itself moves heat around 25 times faster than air. Ice and bare rock are up near 100 times. Those are differences of category rather than degree, friend. And there is a second half to it that people miss even when they have got the first half. The ground is conductive, and, for your purposes, effectively infinite. You can warm the air in a small shelter, friend. Your body puts out somewhere near the heat of an old-fashioned light bulb, and in a small enough enclosed space that is enough to feel. You cannot warm the earth. Under the patch you are lying on there is more cold ground, and under that there is more all the way down. You will pour heat into it all night, and in the morning it will be exactly as cold as it was when you lay down. There is no winning that exchange. There is only slowing it, and everything else follows from that. Air you can beat, friend. Ground you can only insulate against. Number 2. The blanket under you is not a blanket. Here is the detail that catches out people who genuinely know what they are doing. Insulation is not the material. Insulation is the air the material holds. Wool works because it is crimped and springy and traps air in the crimp. Down works because it lofts into a cloud of still air. A pile of dry leaves works by exactly the same mechanism. Now put 180 pounds of sleeping man on top of it. Everything under him crushes flat. The loft goes. The trapped air is squeezed out sideways, and what he is lying on stops being insulation and starts being a thin, damp layer of fiber pressed between his skin and the cold. The blanket over him is still working perfectly, holding its loft, trapping its air, doing exactly what it was made to do. The identical blanket underneath him, same wool, same thickness, is doing close to nothing at all. That is neither folklore nor my opinion, because it is built into the way the modern industry measures its own products. The international standard that sleeping bag temperature ratings are tested against requires an insulating mat of a specified value to be placed underneath the bag during the test. The number printed on that bag is a number that assumes there is something under you. Take that away, and the rating does not degrade a little. It stops meaning anything. A man in 1856 with 2 good wool blankets had a choice to make about those blankets, and almost every instinct he had was pointing him the wrong way. Cold comes from up there, in the sky, in the wind, in the snow coming down. It feels like it comes from above. So you put your covering above. Put both blankets over you, and you have doubled the loft on the half of you that was already the easy half, and left the hard half lying on Wyoming. Put one under and one over, and you have not doubled anything. You have started covering the side that was doing the damage. Number 3. How much of you is touching? The rate of that transfer depends on 3 things. How different the 2 temperatures are, how well the cold thing conducts, and how much of you is against it. You cannot do much about the first. We have just dealt with the second. The third you can change with nothing but your own body, and it is the reason for plenty of behavior in the old accounts that reads as desperation and is actually arithmetic. Curling up shrinks your contact patch and shrinks the surface you are radiating from at the same time. That is why every cold animal on earth does it, and why every cold man does it without being taught. Sitting up on a pack, a stone, a coil of rope, a saddle, anything at all, takes most of you off the ground. Standing takes all of you off it, which is why men who should have been resting kept getting up and moving, and huddling shares it out. The clearest illustration of it sits in the middle of the most famous winter story in American history, and almost nobody who knows that story has noticed it. On the 16th of December, 1846, 17 people left the snowbound camps at Truckee Lake on improvised snowshoes to try to walk out of the Sierra Nevada and bring back help. 2 of them turned back almost at once. The 15 who went on are remembered as the Forlorn Hope. They carried a few days of rations, some blankets, and not much else. Around the 23rd and 24th of December, a bad storm caught them high in the mountains. Rain first, then snow, and it went on for days. Now, they had fire. That is the part that gets lost. But a fire built on deep snow does what fire on deep snow always does. It melts down into it. In the surviving accounts, that fire ended up sitting in a pit several feet below the surface of the snowpack, and the people around it crouched with their feet in ice water, in a hole, with the storm going over the top. Then the wind and the wet got the fire out entirely. One of the party, a man named William Eddy, had them do the only correct thing still available. They spread a blanket on the snow. They sat down on it in a ring, close together, feet piled in toward the middle, and pulled the remaining blankets over their heads and made a tent out of themselves. Read that as engineering rather than misery, and it is rather good. 1 layer of blanket between the whole group and the snow. Every body in contact with 2 other bodies instead of with cold. The exhaled warmth of a dozen people trapped in a small dark volume. It was not enough. 4 of them died in that camp over about 3 days, and the survivors afterwards called the place the Camp of Death. And what happened there next is the part of the Donner story everybody has heard. But I want you to notice what the last resort was when everything else had failed and the fire was out. What they wanted was to get off the snow and up against each other rather than a better roof. Those people, cold and starving and half out of their minds, arrived by instinct at the correct answer. Number 4. Where you put the bed. Everything so far has been about what is under you. This one is about choosing what is under you, and it is where a great many otherwise sensible camps have gone wrong. Start with water, because water is the multiplier on the whole business. Wet soil conducts heat far better than the same soil dry. The water fills the little air pockets that were doing the insulating and replaces still air with a substance about 25 times more conductive. That is the same reason wet clothing is so much more dangerous than dry. The medical literature reckons conductive loss goes up around 5-fold in wet clothing, and up to about 25-fold in cold water. Those are not exaggerations for effect. They come straight out of the difference between water and air. So damp ground sits in another class altogether from dry ground, neighbor. And a great deal of ground that looks dry at dusk is not dry at 4 in the morning. Cold air is denser than warm air. It runs downhill and it pools. A hollow, a dry creek bed, a dip in the meadow, the flat bottom of a little valley. Those places feel sheltered because the wind goes over the top of them, and they sit several degrees colder than the ground 20 feet up the slope. Frost pockets. Any farmer with an orchard on a hillside knows better than to plant his tender trees at the bottom. And there is one more thing worth knowing about the ground on a clear, still night. It does not merely match the air temperature, it radiates its own heat straight up into a clear sky and cools below the air temperature. That is exactly why you can walk out at dawn to a thermometer reading 34 degrees Fahrenheit and find every blade of grass and every fence rail white with frost. The air was above freezing, the surfaces were not. So on the calm, clear night, the night that feels safest, the ground you are about to lie down on is colder than the air you are standing in. Clear sky is a good sign for many things. It is not a good sign for this. Number 5. The shelters that look best and cost most. Now we come to the ones that actively fool people, and each one fails for its own reason. The cave, the rock overhang, the shelf under a ledge. This is the shelter every child draws and every story reaches for, and there is a real reason for that. It is already built. It does not leak, and it does not blow down. It takes no work at all, and when you are cold and tired and losing the light, no work at all is a persuasive argument. But go back to the conductivity list. Rock is at the far wrong end of it. Granite, limestone, the general run of solid stone, all of it moves heat somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 times better than still air. A stone floor is very nearly the worst surface in the natural world to put a warm body on. It is a heat sink with an excellent view. And a cave has a second problem that is the exact inverse of its reputation. A cave of any depth sits near the average annual temperature of the place it is in. That is why cellars are cool in August. It is also why a cave in the northern Rockies in January is a stone box holding a temperature it settled on months ago with no sun on it, and your body is not going to shift it. A cave will keep the snow off you beautifully while it takes everything you have got. Next, the wagon. Emigrants slept under wagons constantly, and it made sense to them, and it makes sense on paper. Roof over the head, something to break the wind, off to one side of the mud. But under a wagon, you are on bare trail. Packed, rutted, wheel-compressed trail, which is soil with the air pressed out of it. Loose dirt is a poor conductor because it is full of air. Packed dirt is a decent one. The most traveled ground in the camp is the worst ground to sleep on, and it is the ground everybody sleeps on, because it is flat and clear of brush. Next, snow. Snow is the one material on this list where the popular belief is half right, and the half that is right is the half people apply wrongly. Fresh fallen snow is a fine insulator. It is mostly air held in a lattice of ice crystals, and its conductive figures come out only 2 or 3 times worse than still air, which puts it in the same rough family as wool. That is why a snow shelter works. A well-made snow cave will hold somewhere near freezing inside, while the country outside is 30 or 40 below, and men have survived nights in one they would not have survived in a canvas tent. But watch what happens when you lie down on it. Packed snow is not fresh snow anymore. It moves heat far better than powder does, And ice, which is what packed snow eventually becomes, is up at the top of the list with rock. And the thing that packs snow more reliably than anything on Earth is a warm, heavy body lying on it, melting the top skin and pressing the rest. You lie down on good insulating powder, and over the course of a night you personally convert it, inch by inch, into a slab of the most conductive material in the whole landscape, molded exactly to the shape of you, for maximum contact. That is the trap in the snow shelter, and it is why the people who actually live in that country build a raised platform inside it and pile browse or hide or pack frames on top of that. The snow roof is doing wonderful work. The snow floor is trying to kill you. One thing before I go on, and then I will not mention it again. Everything I have gathered, the fire, the water, the shelter, the cold, the food, all of it, the way it was actually done, and what it cost the men who got it wrong. It is written down in one book over at orsonrusk.com. 90 methods, plain, with what each one does and what it does not. It is there if you want it. That is all. Now, back to it. Number 6. What the old hands actually did, and how much of it was accident. While the myth was quietly killing the people who followed it, there were men and women in the same country doing the right thing routinely, and mostly for the wrong reasons. Start with the bough bed, because it is the oldest and the best documented. Trappers, guides, loggers, and voyageurs built beds out of evergreen. The old woodcraft manuals are clear about it and very particular. Horace Kephart, whose camping and woodcraft handbooks were the standard for a generation of Americans, puts balsam fir first for the springiness of it and the smell, hemlock and spruce next. And he does not tell you to fling an armful down and lie on it. He tells you rows of small fan-shaped tips, butts pushed into the ground almost upright and bent over so each one is a little spring, the next row overlapping 6 inches in front of the last, working from the head down, with particular attention to the rows under the hips. An hour of work, he says, a full hour for a bed. Nobody writing woodcraft in that era was talking about conductive transfer. Kephart recommends it because it is comfortable and it smells good and it keeps you off the wet. But what he has described in loving detail is a device for holding 4 or 5 inches of dead still air underneath a human being all night, in a form that resists being crushed flat, which is the entire problem we have been circling for the last 20 minutes. He got the right answer for reasons that were only partly the right reasons. That happens constantly in this history, and it is my favorite thing about it. Same story with the buffalo robe. A tanned buffalo hide taken in the cold months, when the coat is at its heaviest, was one of the great trade goods of the plains. Tens of thousands a year went down the Missouri through the trading posts, and a great many ended up as lap robes in carriages and sleighs, which tells you what people valued them for. Depth of fur. And the men who lived out in that country did not put the robe on top. They put it underneath and slept on the hair. Fur under compression still holds far more loft than a woven blanket does, because each hair is stiff enough to stand up under weight. It is the one natural material that partly beats the crushing problem instead of surrendering to it. Then there is the raised bunk. Walk into any restored frontier cabin and look at where the bed is. It sits up on a frame rather than on the floor, sometimes uncomfortably high, sometimes with a second above it. 2 reasons, neighbor, and both are real. Cold air pools at floor level, so the higher you sleep, the warmer the air you sleep in. And a raised bunk is not touching the ground at all, which removes the conductive problem and leaves only the air problem, which is the problem blankets are actually good at solving. Rope lattice, slats, a hide stretched on a frame, corn shuck ticking, straw ticking, All the same job. Get the body off the earth, put still air underneath. And then there is the accident, and this one is documented about as starkly as a thing can be documented. The 12th of January, 1888. The Great Plains. It began as a mild, bright morning, warm enough that people went out in light coats and children walked to school without much on. In the space of a few hours, the temperature dropped catastrophically, in some places to 40 below, with wind near 60 miles an hour and snow so fine and so driven that a man could not see his own hand. It is remembered as the children's blizzard, because so many of the dead were children caught out walking home. The estimates put the toll around 235 people. Among the survivor accounts, there is a pattern that repeats across the whole storm front, in Nebraska and the Dakotas and Minnesota, in families that never met. The people who lived through that night out of doors were very often the people who got into hay, a haystack, a straw pile, a stack standing in a field. They burrowed into it and pulled it in over themselves, and they came out alive. One of them was a schoolteacher named Etta Shattuck, 19 years old, who sent her pupils home and then lost her own way in the whiteout. She got into a haystack and was found alive in it somewhere around 78 hours later. She was terribly frostbitten, and she did not survive the weeks that followed, but she survived that night, in a storm that killed more than 200 people, with no fire, no help, and nothing on her but what she had worn to school in the morning. Because loose hay is exactly the same machine as the bough bed and the buffalo robe. It is a great deal of dead air held in a structure stiff enough not to crush. And crucially, when you burrow into a stack, you end up with as much of it underneath you as over you. You are not lying on the ground at all. Nobody built those haystacks as survival equipment. They were feed for cattle. But that is where the mechanism was, and the people who found it lived. Number 7. The one nobody teaches anymore. Here is where I have watched modern instruction go wrong for years, and it is a subtle enough error that people repeat it in complete good faith. You will be taught to build a shelter. Frame, ribs, thatch, debris piled over the top, a doorway you plug behind you. And then, at the end, almost as a footnote, you will be told to put some leaves inside for a bed. The old hands had it the other way round entirely. The bed was the job. The roof was what you did afterwards if there was light left. And there were 2 rules attached to that bed which have almost completely fallen out of the teaching. The first is that the bed is measured after you lie on it, not before. Loose natural material loses most of its thickness under body weight. It loses it in the first few minutes, and it keeps losing it all night. So the number that matters is how deep the pile is at 4 in the morning with your hip bone in it, friend, rather than how deep it was when you built it. And to have 4 good inches left under your hip at 4 in the morning, you need to start with something around knee-deep. 1.5 feet of loose leaves. A pile that looks, when you finish it, faintly ridiculous. Almost nobody builds it that deep. It feels like far too much. Everyone stops at what looks like plenty, which is about 1/3 of what is wanted, then lies down in a shelter built well and correctly that is going to fail them at 3 in the morning through the floor. The second rule is that a bed is not a thing you build once. The old manuals give it half a sentence and move straight on, and it is easy to read past. A browse bed is a good bed only for as long as it keeps being renewed. Renewed every night. Because a bed that has been slept on has been compressed, and a compressed bed has lost the air, and a bed with no air in it is just a mat. The bough bed you slept on last night is not the bed you built last night. It has to be shaken out and topped up and rebuilt, and the men who did this for a living did it as routine and did not think of it as work worth mentioning. That is the 7th piece. Build the bed first, build it 3 times deeper than looks sensible, and rebuild it every night. There is nothing clever or secret about it. It is tedious, And tedious things are exactly the things that fall out of the teaching first. So let me put the whole of it back together. Those 13 people at Rock Creek Hollow were neither fools nor careless. They were doing the hardest physical work being done anywhere on this continent that year, on short rations, in a storm. And when they finally stopped, they did what every instinct and every piece of advice they had ever been given told them to do. They got under the canvas. They got out of the wind. They lay down. A great many of them had already burned or abandoned their bedding because the handcart emigrants were held to 17 pounds of clothing and bedding ahead, and blankets are heavy. Historians still argue about how many died across the two handcart companies that autumn. The figures usually run somewhere over 200 out of about 980 people, and the counts differ depending on who is counting. What nobody disputes is what those people were short of. They had roof enough. What they lacked was everything that goes underneath. Here is the whole thing in one breath. The ground is not cold air. It is a solid. It conducts many times faster than air, and it never fills up. Your covering crushes flat under you and stops working, so the layer under you has to be a different kind of layer. How much of you is touching is something you control. Wet ground and low ground and clear, calm nights are all worse than they look. Stone and packed snow and hard trail are the worst floors in the country and the most inviting. The old hands beat all of it with evergreen boughs, buffalo hair, raised bunks, and on one January night in 1888 with loose hay. And the last piece, the one that got dropped. Build the bed before the roof. Build it deep enough that it looks foolish. Rebuild it every night, because a flattened bed is no bed at all. Any shelter does not beat no shelter. A shelter that puts you flat on cold ground and takes away your urge to move can be worse than the open, because it keeps you still, and it keeps you satisfied while the earth quietly takes back everything you have got. Get out of the wind by all means, but get off the ground first, friend. So here is the whole of it, friend, and this was never really about shelter. It was about which direction your heat is going, and the answer is down, into the ground, all night, whether you believe it or not. That is not doom talk. Civilization is fine, and your mattress is excellent. The only thing missing is the part of you that knows what to do on a night when there is no mattress, and that part has not gone anywhere. It is only untrained. So do one thing this Saturday, neighbor. Lie down on your own lawn for 10 minutes with nothing underneath you, then do it again with 4 inches of anything folded beneath your hip. You will feel the entire lesson in your own body, and it costs you nothing but a damp shirt. Your great-grandfather built the bed before he built the roof. Somebody just did not get the chance to hand that down to you, friend, and that is what I was here for tonight. Now tell me down below, what did the old people in your family put underneath them? Whether that was straw or corn husks, or a tick mattress or spruce boughs. Every region had its own answer, and the one that comes up most in the comments is the one I build the next video around. That is genuinely how I pick them. Next time we're going inside the cabin itself, at the 30 things every frontier household kept within reach of the door, and how many of them have vanished so completely that most people could not name them if you put one in their hand. That is the whole of it. No trick to it once you know. You